I always believed my wedding would be the happiest day of my life, the day two families came together under the sun of Savannah. But when my brother Daniel arrived late with a silver-wrapped box, everything changed. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, a cruel gift from someone who knew my weaknesses. Hours later, Rachel's father raised a toast with it and collapsed in front of hundreds of guests. Panic swept through the ballroom, and before the night was over, the police stormed in. That bottle was never meant for him. It was meant for me. My name is Alexander Carter, and this is the story of how my wedding became the day my own brother tried to end my life. The music from the string quartet drifted through the salt air as I stepped out onto the patio of the Seabreeze Resort in Savannah, Georgia. The sunlight bounced off the ocean in a way that made the whole place look like it had been painted just for us. My tuxedo felt a little too tight at the collar, but my chest was light, almost weightless. Today was the day I married Rachel, the woman I had spent years believing I might never find. Guests filled the tables draped in white linen, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter surrounding me. I caught sight of my father, Robert Carter, tall and rigid as always, sitting at a table near the front with my mother, Linda, at his side. They both wore that mix of pride and tension parents always do at weddings. But even from a distance, I could see the way Dad's jaw tightened when he scanned the room. He was always measuring, always judging. Rachel appeared beside me in her flowing dress, her hand brushing against mine. And everything around me faded for a moment. Her smile had that calming pull, reminding me of why we were all gathered here. She whispered that she had never seen so many people drinking champagne at noon, and I laughed because it was true. Everyone was in high spirits, as if the entire resort had been transformed into a place where nothing could possibly go wrong. But I knew better than to trust in perfect days. My thoughts drifted back to childhood summers in rural Virginia, where Daniel and I would run barefoot through the fields behind our house. He was always faster, always bolder, the kind of kid who climbed trees higher than anyone else dared. We had been inseparable then, two brothers against the world. Somewhere along the way, the bond cracked. By college, Daniel was skipping classes, chasing schemes, borrowing money he could never repay. I stayed the course, went to law school, built a career in Atlanta. He built excuses. Still, he was my brother, and on a day like this, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could put it all aside. The ceremony moved with a rhythm that felt both surreal and inevitable. Rachel's father, Harold, gave a short speech before the vows, his voice firm but warm, telling me I was now part of his family. The guests applauded Rachel's hand, trembled slightly in mine, and for a fleeting second I thought nothing could touch us. Then the ceremony ended and the reception began. Tables groaned under platters of seafood, and southern cooking laughter rose and fell like the tide. I walked from table to table, thanking people, smiling until my cheeks ached. But Daniel was not there. I checked the entrance every few minutes, trying not to let it show. I told myself it didn't matter, that he would show if he could, but a part of me kept glancing over, waiting. Dad noticed too. He leaned in at one point and muttered under his breath that Daniel probably had better things to do than watch his brother get married. I wanted to snap back to defend him, but I bit down on the words. It was nearly 2 hours into the celebration when I finally saw him. The doors opened and Daniel walked in late, as always, carrying a large box wrapped in silver paper with a velvet ribbon tied around it. His hair was slicked back, his suit a little too shiny, the kind of cut you get when you rent instead of buy. He scanned the room slowly, his eyes sharp, calculating, then settled on me. A hush fell over the nearby tables. Some guests leaned to whisper to each other. My father shifted in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel walked straight toward me, the box balanced carefully in his arms. My stomach tightened as he stopped in front of me. He looked at Rachel for a moment, smiled that smile that never reached his eyes, then turned back to me. "Congratulations, brother," he said quietly, his voice smooth but edged. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." He lifted the box slightly as if presenting a prize. "A wedding gift for you." The silver wrapping gleamed in the light. My hands felt suddenly heavy as I reached to take it. I could feel Rachel watching me, waiting to see how I would react. I could feel my father's stare burning into the back of my neck. I forced a smile, nodded, and held the box in my arms. That was the moment I realized the air in the room had shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The celebration carried on around us, laughter and music filling the space, but under it all, there was a new current running beneath the surface, something sharp and uneasy. And it began with Daniel's late arrival and the gift wrapped too perfectly in silver paper. Rachel laughed softly and urged me to unwrap it. Guests leaned closer, their voices dropping, the sound of forks and glasses quieting as I pulled the ribbon loose and peeled back the silver paper. Inside was a mahogany case polished to a deep shine. My heart thudded as I lifted the lid. Nestled in the velvet lining was a bottle of whiskey, its glass dark with age. The label, yellowed and ornate, printed with the name of a Scottish distillery that had closed decades ago. The seal around the cork was unbroken, a faint wax emblem marking it as something rare. For a moment I just stared. I knew enough about spirits to understand this was no ordinary bottle. It was the kind of thing collectors fought over, a bottle that could fetch thousands of dollars at auction. I felt Rachel squeeze my hand, delighted. She thanked Daniel warmly, her voice carrying over the crowd. A wave of chatter rippled through the tables as people murmured about how extravagant it was. I caught fragments of words, priceless, incredible, how did he get it? But my stomach turned. I knew Daniel's financial reality. He had been scraping by for years, living in a cramped apartment in Jacksonville, dodging creditors, borrowing from anyone foolish enough to believe his promises. The last time I spoke to him about money, he had admitted to owing close to $40,000, a weight that hung over him like a storm cloud. So how could he possibly afford this? I forced a smile as I held the bottle up, the light catching the glass. Guests clapped politely, a few whistled. Rachel leaned in to whisper that it was the most beautiful gift she had ever seen. I nodded, but my chest felt tight, my mind already spinning with questions. Daniel stepped closer. His expression was unreadable at first. Then his mouth curved into a small smile. His eyes, however, stayed cold, sharp, like he was studying me, instead of celebrating with me. He said softly enough that only I could hear, "You deserve to drink this on the most important day of your life." The words slid under my skin. There was nothing warm in them, nothing brotherly. They carried a weight that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I tried to keep my voice even. "This is too much, Daniel. Where did you even find something like this?" He shrugged, still smiling, his gaze flicking briefly toward Rachel before locking back on me. "Let's just say I have my ways. A gift like this should be enjoyed, not questioned." Rachel's father, Harold, had risen from his seat to get a better look. He adjusted his glasses, his deep voice carrying as he remarked on the rarity of the bottle. He told Rachel she had married into a family full of surprises. The guests laughed, though I noticed Dad sitting rigid, his lips pressed together, eyes narrowed on Daniel. I set the bottle back in its case, snapping the lid shut a little too quickly. I wanted it out of sight, out of mind. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered it onto the table. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Daniel had simply wanted to make a statement to show he still had something to give. But the unease lingered. Rachel was radiant, thanking Daniel again, her joy untainted by my doubts. She hugged him lightly, and for a moment he softened, patting her arm, his smile almost believable. But when he pulled away, his eyes found mine again, and whatever softness had flickered there was gone. Guests returned to their conversations, though the whispers continued. I could hear them weighing the price of the bottle, speculating how Daniel had managed it. A few turned their heads toward me as if waiting for me to explain. I kept my smile fixed, my throat dry. Dinner was served, the music swelled, and the night pressed forward. Still, I found myself glancing at the closed mahogany case every few minutes, its presence heavy on the table like a shadow cast over the celebration. Rachel tugged on my arm, telling me to stop looking so serious, that tonight was about us. I kissed her cheek and tried to let it go, but inside I couldn't. The bottle sat there, silent, beautiful, dangerous in a way I couldn't name yet. And when Daniel caught me looking at it again, he didn't say a word. He only raised his glass from across the table, his eyes glinting as if he knew something I didn't. My father's voice cut through the music as he leaned closer across the table, his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on the bottle that now sat closed in its case. "You should not encourage this, Alexander." His tone was low but edged with steel, the same tone he used when giving commands years ago in the army. I tried to brush it off with a half-smile, telling him it was just a gift, but he didn't soften. Robert Carter had always been a man who believed in discipline above all else. At 65, his posture was still ramrod straight, his silver hair cropped short, his dark suit pressed with military precision. Growing up, there was little room for excuses in our house. He expected me to excel and Daniel to fall in line, but only one of us ever did. Beside him, my mother Linda reached for his arm, murmuring gently for him to let it go. Her eyes softer and kind in a way Dad's never were, searched mine as if to apologize for him. She had been the mediator of our family for as long as I could remember, smoothing rough edges, patching over wounds that never fully healed. Dad ignored her. His gaze stayed fixed on me. "You have spent half your life covering for that boy," he said, his voice tightening. "And what has it brought you? Do you remember 2018? The words dropped between us like a weight. I remembered all too well. Daniel had launched a small logistics company in Jacksonville, full of ambition and empty promises. I had warned him about overextending, about the loans he was taking, but he brushed me off. By the end of the year, the company had collapsed, leaving him buried under hundreds of thousands in debt. Creditors hounded him, friends stopped taking his calls, and I found myself stepping in quietly, paying off what I could to keep him afloat. Dad's jaw clenched. "You nearly ruined your own career trying to bail him out, and he learned nothing." I wanted to argue, to say Daniel was family, that he just needed another chance. But the truth caught in my throat. My law practice in Atlanta had nearly folded under the strain of trying to help him. I had taken cases I never wanted, worked sleepless nights, all because I couldn't bear to watch him sink completely. And Daniel had thanked me with little more than a shrug. Linda touched Dad's arm again. "Robert, please, not today. It is Alexander's wedding." But he shook her off, his eyes narrowing on me. "I don't care if it is Christmas morning or Judgment Day, my words are the same. Don't trust him. Not again." I sat back in my chair, forcing a steady breath. Across the room, Rachel was laughing with her bridesmaids, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing at our table. Daniel was leaning near the bar, charming a group of cousins, his laughter a little too loud, his hand gesturing toward the case that held the whiskey. I thought of all the times I had defended him to Dad, insisting he was just unlucky, misunderstood, too reckless, but never malicious. I remembered nights Daniel had shown up at my apartment in Atlanta, drunk and broke, pleading for help. I had always given in. Now, with Dad's words hanging over me, the doubt that had been gnawing at me since I saw the bottle only grew sharper. Dad leaned closer, his voice dropping lower. You are a good man, Alex. Too good. But that boy will drag you down if you let him, mark my words. The music swelled again. Glasses clinked and the moment passed for everyone else. But in my chest, a fissure had opened, the weight of old wounds pressing down. I nodded faintly, not to agree, but to end the conversation. Still his words echoed in my head, heavy and unshakable. Don't trust him. Not again. The ballroom glittered with light as the band struck up a lively tune and guests filled the dance floor. Roses and hydrangeas spilled from tall crystal vases, their fragrance mixing with the scent of the sea drifting in through the Owen Terrace doors. Laughter rose in bursts, glasses clinked, and the air felt charged with joy. Rachel moved through the room in her gown like sunlight breaking across the horizon. Her cheeks flushed from smiling so much. Emily, her younger sister, stayed close to her side, making sure the train of her dress didn't catch on chairs, handing her champagne when her glass ran empty. Emily was quick with jokes, her laughter effortless, and she pulled me into their circle with ease. It was hard not to notice how different she was from Rachel, bolder. Her teasing aimed at both of us, but her warmth undeniable. At the head table, Harold Whitmore rose from his chair, the room quieting as soon as he cleared his throat. At 62, his presence carried weight, the years he had spent as a judge in Savannah lending his voice a gravity few men had. He spoke of Rachel's childhood, her determination, her kindness, and then turned to me, telling the guests how proud he was to welcome me into their family. His words were steady, deliberate, and when he finished, the applause rolled through the room like thunder. I felt Rachel's hand slide into mine, her eyes glistening, and for a moment I let myself believe this was the perfect night we had dreamed about. The music swelled again, couples drifting back onto the dance floor. I followed Rachel as she was pulled into a dance with her uncle, her laughter echoing above the music. Emily caught my arm, insisting I join for the next song, and soon I found myself surrounded by spinning dresses and flushed faces, the world a blur of color and motion. As the band shifted into a slower melody, Harold made his way back toward the head table. His gaze landed on the mahogany case resting at the center, unopened since Daniel had presented it. He motioned for the servers to clear some space and then beckoned me forward. "Alexander," he said with a smile that stretched across his weathered face, "this is the moment. A wedding is not complete without a toast that will be remembered. And what better way to honor this union than by sharing the gift your brother has so generously brought?" The room hushed again, every eye turning toward the case. My chest tightened. I saw Rachel's excitement as she whispered that it was perfect, that everyone would remember this toast forever. Daniel stood near the back, his hands tucked into his pockets, his lips curving just slightly. His eyes never left me. I hesitated, the memory of my father's warning still echoing in my head. But Harold, with the authority of a man used to commanding courtrooms, reached for the case himself. His hands were steady as he lifted the lid, the bottle gleaming under the chandelier light. He held it up for all to see, the wax seal catching the glow. The guests murmured in awe, glasses lifted in anticipation. Rachel squeezed my arm, her voice low and filled with happiness. "Let's do it. Let's open it now." I swallowed, forcing a smile, watching as Harold carefully broke the seal with the precision of a man who had spent decades handling evidence and fragile truths. The cork gave a soft pop that seemed louder than the music, a sound that silenced the room in an instant. The scent drifted out, rich and earthy, carrying years of history in its depth. Harold tilted the bottle, filling the first glass with deliberate care, his eyes twinkling as if he had been waiting all night for this moment. The toast was about to begin. Harold raised his glass, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the kind of authority that silenced a crowd without effort. He thanked the guests for joining, spoke of family, of two lives becoming one, and of the weight of promises that should never be broken. The room was quiet except for the crackle of ice in glasses and the faint hum of the band waiting for their cue to return. Everyone leaned in, waiting for the moment when the whiskey would seal the toast and mark the night in memory. The glass touched his lips, his eyes closed briefly as if savoring the ritual. He let the whiskey roll over his tongue before swallowing, his brows lifting in surprise. He chuckled, tapping the glass with his fingertip. "Bold," he said, his voice warm. "It's been a long time since I've tasted something with this much fire." The guests laughed lightly, raising their glasses, echoing the motion. A dozen hands reached upward, clinking crystal with crystal smiles, bright voices layered over one another in celebration. I lifted mine out of instinct, though the liquid inside felt heavier than it should. My gaze slipped toward Daniel. He hadn't touched his glass, not even raised it halfway. He simply stood at the far end of the table, his lips curled in that half smile, his eyes locked on me like a challenge. A flicker of unease stirred in my chest, but before I could dwell on it, Harold cleared his throat to continue. His words faltered. A cough slipped out, sharp and unexpected. He pressed a fist against his chest, waved off Rachel's concerned touch, and tried to laugh it away. The crowd chuckled nervously, believing it was nothing more than a scratch in his throat. But then another cough came, deeper, harsher, echoing off the ballroom walls. His face tightened, his eyes watering as he reached for his glass of water. Rachel's voice cut through the laughter, strained and high. "Dad!" The glass slipped from his hand, water spilling across the white linen tablecloth. His shoulders jerked as the coughing worsened, his chest heaving in uneven bursts. Guests pushed their chairs back, the scraping sound harsh against the polished floor. Some gasped, others whispered, their voices mixing in an anxious murmur. Then his face changed. The color drained, leaving his skin pale and ashen, his lips darkening at the edges. His eyes widened, panic flashing in them as his knees buckled. The glass shattered on the floor, fragments scattering as Harold crumpled beside the head table. The room erupted. Someone screamed. A woman fainted against her husband's chest. Rachel dropped to the ground, cradling her father's head in her lap, her sobs tearing through the ballroom. Emily knelt beside her, fumbling for her phone with shaking hands, shouting for someone to call 911. I dropped to my knees, my pulse racing. Harold's chest barely rose, his breath shallow and ragged, a rattle that sent dread clawing through me. My father, Robert, was already moving, his training from years ago alive in his sharp commands. Tilt his head back. Clear the airway. He pressed his fingers against Harold's neck, searching for a pulse, his jaw set. Linda clutched his arm, praying under her breath, her rosary beads slipping between her fingers. Around us, chaos boiled over. Guests backed away in shock, others pressed forward, desperate to help but frozen in fear. The band had gone silent, their instruments hanging at their sides. The only sound was Rachel's voice, broken and frantic, begging her father to stay with her. I tried to focus, to ground myself, but all I could see was the untouched glass in front of Daniel. My stomach twisted as I remembered his words from earlier. "You deserve this." His voice replayed in my head, colder now, echoing with menace. The seconds dragged. Rachel screamed at the dispatcher over the phone, giving the address through tears. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each desperate heartbeat. I pressed my palms to the floor, fighting to steady myself. But every instinct screamed that something had gone terribly wrong, that this was no accident. Harold convulsed suddenly, his body jerking as Robert barked for space. The guests stumbled back, clearing a circle as Robert started chest compressions. His movements harsh and rhythmic. Rachel sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her father's hand, refusing to let go. Emily pulled her back, whispering desperately that help was coming, that she had to give them room. The doors burst open with a crash. Paramedics rushed inside their uniforms, a blur of navy and reflective strips carrying bags of equipment. They knelt beside Harold, immediately taking over from my father, their voices clipped and efficient. Oxygen mask, epinephrine, start compressions again. The sound of a monitor pierced the air, flatlining before it picked up into a weak, faltering rhythm. I stumbled back, my legs weak. My hand found the back of a chair, gripping it tightly as I stared at the whiskey bottle still standing on the table. The seal broken, the scent of oak and smoke lingering in the air. It felt like a silent witness to something unspeakable. Daniel still hadn't moved. He leaned casually against a pillar, his posture calm, detached from the storm that had overtaken the room. His eyes never left me, sharp and unwavering, as if daring me to put the pieces together. The paramedics worked furiously, their movements almost violent in their urgency. Rachel's cries turned hoarse, her voice cracking as she pleaded with them to save her father. Emily held her tightly, tears streaming down her own face. Linda had sunk into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she whispered prayers. Robert stood rigid, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. The monitor beeped again, sharp and unsteady as the compressions continued. Every sound cut deeper, each second stretching into eternity. I felt trapped inside the moment, the celebration of my wedding dissolving into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. And in the midst of it all, the whiskey sat untouched, its amber glow mocking me under the chandelier light. The sirens grew louder until they were no longer outside, but right at the doors, flashing red and blue lights bleeding into the ballroom's golden glow. Uniformed officers streamed in, their radios crackling, their voices clipped and commanding as they called for people to step back. The chaos of the wedding guests collided with the authority of law enforcement shouts, mixing with sobs. Heels scraping against marble as people tried to move yet could not look away. Rachel was on the floor, her face buried in Emily's shoulder. Her sobs breaking into shallow breaths until finally she collapsed entirely. Her body limp. Emily screamed for help, clutching her sister as two paramedics rushed to lift her onto a stretcher. My chest tightened as I tried to go to her, but a firm hand on my shoulder stopped me. An officer shook his head, telling me they had to get her stabilized, that I needed to stay back. Robert had his arms wrapped protectively around Linda, who was trembling badly, her rosary clattered against the sequins of her dress. His jaw was set, his eyes narrow, watching everything with a soldier's suspicion, as if scanning for threats. That was when I saw him. Detective Marcus Doyle, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that made the noise fade just by the weight of his stride. His eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the room, not like a guest seeing tragedy, but like a hunter following the trail of something inevitable. He spoke quickly to the paramedics, his voice steady and low, then turned to the officers around him. "Lock the exits. Nobody leaves until we get statements." The words cut through me like ice. The guests, dressed in silk gowns and black tuxedos, gasped in protest, but the officers pushed them back, guiding them into clusters at the edges of the ballroom. The sound of crying and whispered confusion filled the air. The music equipment abandoned, the chandeliers gleaming cruelly over what had turned into a crime scene. I stood frozen, my eyes unable to leave the table. The bottle, still gleaming with its wax seal cracked open, was being handled now by a young officer wearing gloves. He carefully slipped it into a clear evidence bag, the glass clinking against plastic as the amber liquid sloshed faintly. The sight of the whiskey disappearing into police custody struck me harder than anything else. That was Daniel's gift, my brother's gift. Now it was evidence. Detective Doyle noticed me staring. He walked over, his eyes fixed on me, his steps deliberate. He stopped just close enough that I felt the weight of his scrutiny. "You're the groom, right, Alexander Carter?" I nodded, my throat tight, my voice catching when I tried to answer. "Yes." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never softening. "You recognize that bottle?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. It was a wedding gift from my brother. The detective's eyes flicked to where Daniel stood in the shadows, leaning with that same casual air as if none of this touched him. Doyle's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing before he looked back at me. "We'll need to talk." I felt my stomach drop. Around us, the ballroom buzzed with panic. Guests whispered theories, some even shot glances toward my family, as if the crime were already written on our faces. The sound of Rachel's stretcher being wheeled out echoed behind me. Her faint cries, a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I tried to move toward her, but Detective Doyle's voice cut through again. "Stay here. We'll need your statement soon." I turned back toward Daniel, desperate for some sign, some explanation, but he only offered me that same thin smile. He raised his empty hands slightly, as if to say he was untouched by any of this. But his eyes glimmered cold and unreadable. The officers moved with mechanical precision, photographing the table, marking the floor where Harold had fallen, bagging glasses that still held traces of the amber liquid. The smell of it lingered in the air, sharp and biting now that I knew it might be poison. Each click of the camera felt like a nail sealing the coffin of what had been my wedding day. Linda whimpered, clinging tighter to Robert, who looked as though he wanted to tear the whole room apart until he found the truth. His eyes met mine, steady and grim, silently confirming what he had warned me earlier. "Don't trust him. Not again." The detective's voice rose above the noise, commanding and firm. "Everyone remain calm. We will be speaking with you one by one. Please cooperate." I felt eyes on me, dozens of them, suspicion blooming where joy had been hours earlier. I was the groom, the son-in-law, the man who had raised a glass with his father-in-law moments before he collapsed. And now I was also the brother of the man whose gift sat sealed in an evidence bag, glowing under harsh fluorescent light like a cursed relic. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I pressed them against the table, trying to steady myself. Around me the air felt thick, the weight of judgment pressing down with every second. Rachel was gone. Harold was fighting for his life, and the one object tying everything together was the whiskey that Daniel had chosen for me. Detective Doyle gave a curt nod to the officer holding the evidence bag, then looked back at me. "This bottle is now property of Charleston Police Department. Do not discuss it with anyone outside of this investigation." His words were heavy, absolute, leaving no room for comfort. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to shake Daniel until he broke his silence. But all I could do was watch as the bottle disappeared into the chain of custody, sealed away as the first piece of a puzzle I had never wanted to be part of. The ballroom had been transformed in less than an hour. What had been filled with flowers and laughter now held crime scene tape cameras and officers guarding the doors. Guests huddled together, whispering about betrayal, poison, and family secrets. And at the center of it all was me, the groom who had lost his wedding to a glass of whiskey and the shadow of my brother's smile. Detective Doyle pulled me aside, his presence cutting through the noise like a blade, his eyes fixed on me as if I were the hinge to this entire disaster. He asked why my brother would give me such an expensive bottle, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made it impossible to mistake his suspicion. I opened my mouth, but the words felt stuck in my throat. I told him Daniel and I had a complicated history, that I had no idea how he could afford something like that I didn't even know why he came at all. The detective raised an eyebrow, waiting, almost daring me to say more. I swallowed hard, adding that Daniel had debts, that his business failed years ago, that I hadn't trusted him for a long time. Doyle nodded slowly, not writing anything down, just studying my face, searching for cracks. Behind him, Olivia Grant was moving like a shadow among the chaos. Her notebook flipped open, her pen flying across the page. She wasn't just a guest, though. That was her cover tonight. She was a reporter for the Charleston Herald, and I knew the moment her eyes lit up that the story had already begun to leave this room. The guests whispered louder now, their voices slicing through the silence between Doyle's questions. I caught pieces of it. Did you hear it was his brother, a family feud? Poison. The Carters are ruined. Each word chipped away at what was left of the night. Doyle leaned closer, his voice so low it forced me to listen. Has your brother ever threatened you before? I hesitated. I thought of the fights, the slammed doors, the debts he asked me to cover, the resentments never spoken but always there. I admitted Daniel had caused me trouble, but no. He never outright threatened my life. Doyle's eyes flicked to where Daniel leaned against a pillar, calm. Collected his hands, folded like he was watching a performance. The detective exhaled sharply, then turned back to me. Until I know otherwise, I'm treating that bottle as an attempt on someone's life. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, but before I could answer, the sound of wheels against marble broke through. Paramedics rushed through the ballroom again, this time moving with urgency that silenced the whispers. Harold's stretcher was surrounded, monitors beeping, a mask pressed over his face. His color was wrong, pale and gray, his body jerking weakly as they pushed him toward the doors. Rachel appeared at his side, tears streaking her cheeks, her hand clinging desperately to his arm as if her grip could anchor him back to life. Emily stumbled behind, her voice cracking as she called out for her father. Linda covered her mouth, shaking violently in Robert's arms. One of the paramedics shouted for space, his voice sharp, and the crowd split, creating a narrow passage toward the exit. I stood frozen, every beat of my heart pounding in my ears as Harold, the man who had welcomed me into his family, was carried away from my wedding, not in triumph but in crisis. Then came the words that shattered whatever hope remained. The doctor following the stretcher stopped long enough to speak to Doyle. His tone was clipped, clinical, but every syllable struck me with brutal clarity. We believe the victim was poisoned. The silence after was heavier than the music ever had been. Gasps rippled across the ballroom, hands clutched pearls, others gripped champagne flutes until glass cracked. All eyes turned first toward the bottle sealed in plastic, then toward me, and then inevitably toward Daniel. Rachel screamed, collapsing again, her voice breaking into sobs as Emily tried to hold her upright. Robert's face hardened into steel, his grip tightening on Linda as if ready to shield her from everything that might come next. Olivia's pen scratched faster, her eyes darting between the family and the detective as if the story were writing itself without her help. Doyle gave the order to secure the ballroom further, his voice carrying authority that no one could question. Officers closed in tighter, preventing anyone from stepping too close to the evidence or the family. The guests retreated to corners, their whispers now poisoned with speculation, each one heavier than the last. I felt my legs weaken, the floor unsteady beneath me. Poison. The word echoed in my skull until it was all I could hear. Doyle's gaze returned to me, unwavering. He asked if I still thought my brother had no reason to hurt me. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. My throat was dry, my chest heavy. I turned my head and found Daniel's eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He only tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into something that could never be mistaken for kindness. And at that moment, with Harold's stretcher disappearing into the night and the detective's questions pressing down on me, I realized that whatever truth lay behind that bottle, it was already tearing my family apart. Detective Doyle gave instructions to one of the officers, his voice low but sharp. And soon a technician moved toward the bottle, sliding it carefully into a second layer of protective plastic. Doyle turned back to me, his tone measured but heavy. The initial signs suggest a toxin. We need lab work to confirm, but this wasn't random. Someone intended this. The words punched through the fog in my head. Intended, planned, not a tragic accident, not bad luck. This was someone's design. I looked around the room, but every face I saw was twisted in fear, suspicion, or disbelief. And then my eyes inevitably found Daniel. He was leaning against the far wall. His jacket unbuttoned, his tie slightly loose, looking like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't pale or nervous or even worried. Instead, his lips curled at the edges in a way that chilled me. His calmness was louder than any confession. Doyle caught the exchange. He asked me directly if Daniel had reason to harm me. My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. I told him about the years of debts, the failed business in 20, the loans he begged from me. The anger that boiled when I finally said no. I remembered the arguments late at night, my father's voice echoing down the hall, warning me not to bail him out again. I recalled Daniel's eyes, sharp with resentment, when he spat out that one day I'd regret not standing by him. The memory cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Doyle wrote a note this time, his pen scratching slowly, deliberately. He asked if Daniel knew I'd be receiving other expensive gifts tonight, or if this whiskey had been the only one. I told him the truth. There had been plenty of envelopes, plenty of champagne, plenty of gestures from people trying to impress us. But none of them arrived wrapped in silver paper. None of them carried Daniel's smile. Across the room, Rachel sat in a chair now, her hands shaking as Emily knelt beside her. Rachel's dress was crumpled from the chaos, her eyes red and swollen. She whispered that she should have stopped Harold from drinking first, that she should have seen something, known something. I crouched down beside her, my hand covering hers, and told her it wasn't her fault. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. Because deep down I knew exactly who was responsible. The voices of the guests rose again, fragments of their panic floating to my ears. Poison, family feud, it was meant for the groom. Each whisper coiled around me, choking tighter until I felt like the ballroom was closing in. Doyle stepped between me and the crowd. His hand raised for silence, his presence commanding enough to still most of the noise. He announced that the whiskey would be tested immediately, that the results would determine the nature of the crime, but that from everything he had seen so far, this was intentional. I felt my knees weaken at the word intentional. My wedding night had become a crime scene. My father stood off to the side, his jaw clenched, his eyes on Daniel like he had been waiting for this moment all his life. My mother leaned into him, her hands shaking, her lips moving in silent prayer. Doyle turned back to me once more. If your brother wanted to hurt you, is there anything else he could gain from it? I knew the answer before he finished asking. My assets, the trust accounts, the house. I had just closed on everything I had built as a lawyer who never stopped working, never stopped proving myself. Daniel knew all of it. He had tried to get his hands on pieces of it before, and yet when I looked at him, his face carried no desperation. He tilted his head, smiled faintly, and lifted his glass of water and mocked salute as if the night were nothing more than theater. It sent a wave of cold through me, deeper than the Atlantic outside those windows. I tried to focus, tried to hold on to the sound of Rachel's voice beside me, the sobs of Emily, the murmur of my parents, but Daniel's quiet smirk sliced through it all. It wasn't just confidence. It was mockery. I turned to Doyle and told him Daniel had always wanted what he couldn't have, that he had resented me for every success, every approval from our father, every moment I stood where he couldn't. I told him Daniel wasn't the kind of man who would sit still while I had everything he lost. Doyle's eyes hardened, and he said the words that settled into the pit of my stomach like lead. If that is true, then he didn't bring that bottle to celebrate you. He brought it to end you. The ballroom spun around me, but when I looked back to Daniel, he only sipped his water, calm and steady, as if none of this touched him at all. Rachel's hand clutched my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve as her voice cracked through the hum of the shaken guests. Did you know, Alexander? Did you know your brother was capable of something like this? Her eyes burned with a mixture of fear and betrayal, and in that moment she was not my bride of only a few hours, but a woman demanding an answer that I could not give. My throat locked, the words choking before they could form, and the silence between us spoke louder than anything I might have said. Robert stepped forward, his face red with fury, his voice cutting through the ballroom like a blade. Enough of this. He pointed directly at Daniel, his hand trembling not with age but with unrestrained rage. That man tried to kill Harold. Officer, put him in cuffs right now. The detective raised a hand, urging calm, but Robert slammed his fist against the back of a chair so hard the wood splintered. He had always been a man of control, a soldier who carried discipline in his bones, but tonight his restraint was gone. Linda rushed to her husband's side, her sobs loud and pleading. Robert, please stop this. He is still our son. She clung to his arm, tears streaming down her cheeks, her voice breaking as she turned to the detective. He would never do this. He is confused, lost maybe, but he would not poison a man. Her desperation filled the room, and for a moment even the murmuring guests went quiet, watching the scene unfold as if it were theater too raw to believe. Rachel shook her head, her grip on me tightening. You cannot defend him anymore, Alexander. Look at him. She gestured toward Daniel, who sat calm and collected his fingers, tracing the rim of his water glass as though none of the storm swirling around him mattered. This is not a man wrongly accused. This is someone who enjoys watching us tear each other apart. Her words pierced me because they carried truth I did not want to see. Emily, her younger sister, stepped forward, her voice steady though her hands trembled. I have seen him before, sneaking conversations in the hallway during the rehearsal dinner, whispering into his phone. He had envelopes, cash maybe, and when he noticed me, he turned away. Do not tell me this is a misunderstanding. Her accusation fueled the fire whispers rippling through the tables as guests leaned closer, some gasping, others shaking their heads. The detective held up the sealed evidence bag with the whiskey bottle inside, its amber glow muted under plastic. This bottle is the reason we are here, he said firmly. Until the lab results confirm what we suspect, no one leaves and no one accuses anyone without proof. His words were measured, but the weight of suspicion hung heavy, and all eyes drifted back to Daniel, who finally lifted his head and smiled faintly as though savoring his role in this chaos. Robert's voice rose again, thick with anger. Proof. You want proof. Harold is in a hospital bed fighting for his life because of that bottle. What more proof do you need? His fury shook the air, and for a heartbeat I thought he might charge across the room at Daniel, but Linda held him tighter, her cries almost frantic. Please, Robert, please, not like this. We cannot lose both of them tonight. I felt the heat of every gaze on me, my bride waiting for me to condemn my own brother, my father demanding I stand with him in rage, my mother begging me to protect the family, and Emily pressing her quiet certainty that Daniel was behind it all. I stood in the center of the storm, unable to move, every choice carving a wound deeper than the last. My chest ached with the weight of it, and still Daniel sat there calm as stone, his smirk taunting me without a word. Rachel's voice broke the silence again, soft now but sharper than any scream. If you stand with him, Alexander, you stand against me. I saw the tears trembling in her eyes, but behind them was a resolve that chilled me. She meant every word. Around us the guests shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding my gaze, others staring openly, waiting to see which side I would choose. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, Robert tore free of Linda's grip and stepped forward, his hand jabbing the air at Daniel. "If the police will not do it, I will." He started toward my brother, but two officers moved quickly, holding him back. The ballroom erupted into shouts, chairs scraping across the floor. The once elegant wedding turned battlefield of words and fear. Rachel pulled me closer, Emily at her side, their unity against Daniel now drawing a line between the Whitmores and the Carters that could not be erased. Linda collapsed into a chair, sobbing, her face buried in her hands. She rocked slightly, whispering words I could not catch, prayers or pleas lost under the noise. Robert strained against the officers, still shouting for justice, for action, his fury echoing in the vaulted ceiling. And in the middle of it, Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the chaos. "You all think you know me, but you know nothing." His words hung like a curse, chilling the room. The detective ordered everyone to sit, his voice commanding, his patience thinning. "This is not a trial. Not yet." He locked eyes with me as if daring me to break the silence. I felt my world collapsing, the marriage I had dreamed of dissolving into suspicion and anger before it even began. Rachel's hand slipped from my arm, and when I turned to her, I saw a distance in her gaze that frightened me more than anything else. And as the noise finally dulled into heavy breathing and muffled sobs, I realized that the war tearing through this ballroom was no longer about a poisoned glass, but about the fracture of two families on the night they were supposed to become one. The detective's phone buzzed against the table, its sharp vibrations slicing through the quiet. Marcus stepped aside, speaking low, but the tension in his shoulders gave away the weight of what he heard. He returned with his eyes narrowed, the whiskey bottle still in its plastic bag, resting on his palm like a loaded weapon. "The lab moved fast," he said, "too fast for comfort. What they found was not random. The toxin matched one from a prior case in Atlanta 2 years ago. A deliberate poisoning that left a man dead at his own office party." The words clamped around my chest. Atlanta, 2 years ago. I tried to imagine the faceless victim, a stranger whose death now echoed in my wedding hall. Marcus's gaze swept the room, then landed squarely on Daniel. This was not a mistake, not spoiled liquor. This was intentional. Someone wanted that bottle to kill. Murmurs surged through the guests again, people shifting nervously, clutching their coats and purses as though preparing to flee. Rachel stiffened beside me, her breath sharp, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Alexander, what does this mean?" I could not answer. My thoughts spun, replaying every moment Daniel had ever asked for help, every desperate call about money, every time I told myself he just needed another chance. Marcus pulled out another sheet of paper, freshly printed. We traced the purchase. This bottle did not come from any collector or store. It came from a broker who moves counterfeit and rare liquors through private deals. Your brother paid cash for it last month. The detective's words felt like nails driving into my skull. Daniel did not flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling at the edge as though this unveiling of his secret amused him. My father erupted again, his voice booming. You see, Alexander, I warned you. He bought the poison. He brought it here." The officers tightened their grip around Robert to keep him from lunging, but his fury only shook harder. Linda pleaded again, her voice breaking under the weight of denial. Maybe it was not him, maybe someone set him up. But her words faded as Marcus shook his head. "The evidence is solid." Then came the twist that hollowed my stomach. Marcus looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter, the intended victim, was not Mr. Whitmore. The dosage, the placement, everything points to you. Harold drank only because he raised his glass first. Had you been the one to take the first sip, you would not be standing here." The floor seemed to fall away, my knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep upright. My wedding night, the one I had imagined filled with laughter and music, had been engineered as my grave. I stared at Daniel, my brother, the boy who once shared a bedroom with me, who once whispered secrets into the dark when storms rattled our windows. He met my gaze without remorse, his expression almost triumphant, as though he had been waiting for this revelation all along. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes darted from me to Daniel, horror spreading across her face. Emily clutched her sister's arm, whispering that she knew it, she had seen the signs. Robert cursed under his breath, his anger turning into something heavier, almost grief. And Linda collapsed against her chair again, shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no." Marcus spoke again, his voice steady. "Motive matters, and the motive here is clear. Money, control, inheritance." With Harold incapacitated, suspicion would scatter. But if Alexander had fallen tonight, the insurance policies, the assets, the firm shares, all of it, would eventually shift toward family. He turned the paper in his hand, showing transactions, debts, numbers that bled red across the page. Daniel's name was tied to every one of them. My chest tightened with rage, with heartbreak, with the crushing realization that the man across from me had plotted my end for nothing more than escape from his own ruin. Memories flooded back, his begging for loans, his excuses about partners who betrayed him, his promises to pay me back. All of it had been a script rehearsed for years, ending tonight in a toast that was never meant to bless me but to bury me. I heard myself speaking before I knew I had opened my mouth. "Why, Daniel? Why me?" He tilted his head, his calm never breaking. "Because you had everything. The career, the respect, the life. You never stumbled. You never drowned like I did, and you never once thought what it felt like to live in my shadow." His voice was cold, but beneath it I caught the tremor of envy that had festered for decades. The ballroom fell silent. Guests no longer whispered. They stared, waiting for what would come next, the revelation too raw to be mistaken for anything but truth. Rachel's tears streaked her cheeks as she pulled slightly away from me. Her trust shaken not by me, but by the shattering of the family she had married into. Emily stood rigid, her jaw set as though ready to shield her sister from the storm. Robert sagged back into his chair, his anger replaced by the hollow look of a man who realized he had failed to keep his family from imploding. Linda rocked slowly, muttering prayers through her tears, clinging to a son who had already slipped away, and me. I stood rooted in the center, the groom who had been handed a coffin disguised as a gift. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath sharp and uneven. I looked at Daniel one last time and saw not a brother but a stranger who had carried my blood in his veins, yet wanted it spilled on the floor of my wedding night. The chandelier above swayed slightly, its light fractured across the polished floor. And I understood that nothing about this night could ever be undone. The truth was out, the betrayal bare, and though Harold fought for his life in a hospital bed, the man who had poisoned him had meant that fate for me. And in that quiet between breaths, the weight of what almost happened pressed so deep into my chest that I thought it might crush me from within. Rachel stood frozen, her hand trembling as she clutched the hem of her gown. Her eyes did not follow Daniel. They locked on me wide and wet, as if silently asking how this could be happening under our roof, under our name. Emily pressed close to her, whispering for her to breathe, to hold steady. My mother's wails filled the room, high and broken, begging the officers to stop, insisting her son could not have done this. My father did not move. His face was stone, his arms folded, his silence an unspoken judgment heavier than any words. Flashes from cameras burst suddenly across the ballroom. Olivia Grant had her phone raised, her expression sharpened with the instinct of a predator who smelled a story. Her notepad was already full, her recorder blinking red. She leaned toward another guest, speaking in hushed tones while scribbling, her eyes flicking between Daniel's collapse and my stillness. I caught the whisper of her headline before she even wrote it down. Wedding turns crime scene. The police led Daniel past the double doors, his shouting echoing back into the hall. His last words to me before he vanished were venom. His voice low but clear. "This should have been you." Silence clung to the ballroom after he was gone, broken only by the faint hum of the chandelier and the murmurs of frightened guests. People filed out quickly, whispering into their phones, the story already leaving these walls before the tables had been cleared. My wedding, the day meant to bind two families, had been reduced to gossip, scandal, and photographs that would stain tomorrow's headlines. Rachel finally turned from me, her veil brushing against her cheek as she sank into a chair. Her chest heaved, her shoulders curled inward as though she could fold herself small enough to disappear. I reached for her, but she shook her head, tears streaming down. "Alexander," she whispered, "I do not know if I can carry this." Her words sliced through me, heavier than the detective's accusations, heavier than my brother's betrayal. Later, after the ballroom had emptied and officers kept their posts by the doors, I wandered into the courtyard alone. The air outside was cool, the scent of salt from the ocean drifting inland, but it did nothing to clear the heaviness inside me. I sat on the stone ledge, the echoes of the evening replaying over and over. Harold's glass falling, his body crumpling, Rachel's sobs. Daniel's smirk, the sound of the cuffs. A car idled at the front, press gathered in clusters, their voices carrying into the night. I could hear Olivia giving her statement to a cameraman, her words sharp, deliberate, already shaping the story. A respected attorney's wedding ruined by a poisoning plot. Family betrayal, wealth inheritance. The kind of story that would run for weeks, picked apart by strangers who would never know the truth but would believe every word printed on a page. I closed my eyes, trying to steady the rage crawling inside me. I wanted to believe that justice would prevail, that the evidence would crush Daniel's excuses, but another part of me knew how stories worked once they left your hands. My reputation, carefully built over years of discipline, of cases won, of trust earned, was already unraveling. Not because of what I did, but because of who I shared blood with. Rachel came to the courtyard eventually, Emily behind her. She stood at a distance, her arms crossed, her expression torn between love and exhaustion. We did not speak. The silence between us was louder than any argument, heavy with the unspoken fear that what happened tonight would not only end Daniel's freedom, but could also erode the foundation of our marriage before it truly began. I watched the lights from the news vans flicker against the windows. My father had retreated upstairs. My mother sat curled in a corner of the ballroom, clutching a rosary, whispering prayers into her hands. Guests had long fled, leaving behind coats, purses, half-finished glasses, all reminders of a celebration that had turned into evidence. I thought about karma, the invisible hand. That people spoke of the belief that what you put into the world came back in kind. If that was true, then Daniel's chains were only the beginning of what he would face. But where did that leave me, the man who had tried to save him too many times? The man who stood at the altar, blind to the storm already brewing inside his own bloodline. The courtyard lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. I sat alone as voices drifted away and silence reclaimed the night. My tuxedo felt heavier than steel, my ring colder than the ocean breeze. This was supposed to be the happiest night of my life, yet all I could see was the wreckage. My brother in chains, my wife in tears, my family fractured, and my name already whispered through the city as if I were guilty too. I leaned forward, pressing my elbows to my knees, staring at the cracks in the stone. Everything I had built seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Not because of a case I lost or a law I broke, but because the one person who should have stood beside me as family had chosen instead to make me his enemy. The night stretched on heavy and endless as I sat in the shadows of my own ruined wedding, knowing that no vows spoken could repair what had been torn apart. Morning came with the faint sound of gulls circling over the harbor and the soft crash of waves against the shore. The resort looked almost peaceful from the balcony, as if the night before had been nothing more than a nightmare that dissolved with the sunrise. Yet inside me the weight of reality pressed down harder than ever. I had a wife lying restless in the next room, a father whose silence had become an indictment, a mother whose tears felt endless, and a brother now locked behind bars. By noon, news came that Harold had survived. The poison had nearly stopped his heart, but doctors stabilized him. He would recover with time, though the tremor in his voice over the phone was evidence of how close death had come. He asked to speak with me alone, and when I took the call, his tone was steady. Firm, sharper than I expected from a man still weak in a hospital bed. He said he would testify against Daniel without hesitation. He told me no family tie, no excuse of debt or desperation could erase the intent of murder. His words cut clean, not cruel but final. I thanked him, though my throat felt raw, and for a moment I hated that my wedding day had turned him into both victim and witness. Rachel stood beside me, listening, her hand slipping into mine as Harold's voice faded. She did not need to say anything. Her grip was strong, her eyes red from hours of tears. But in them I saw a quiet resolve. She had not left, though she could have. She had not pulled away, though every headline painted me guilty by association. She stayed, and in her silence I understood that the vows we spoke had not been lost completely, even if the celebration had. The following week blurred into interviews, depositions, endless questions from detectives, and a storm of reporters camped outside my office in Charleston. Olivia's story had run first, splashed across every site and paper by morning, but what followed was even harsher. Photos of Rachel crying, my mother screaming, Daniel shouting as he was dragged away. The headlines twisted my career into a shadow of doubt. Could a lawyer who could not see his own brother's betrayal be trusted to see the truth in court? I read them all, even when Rachel begged me not to. But amid the chaos, the facts sharpened. The forensic team confirmed what we had suspected. The poison was no accident, not a random flaw. It matched the same toxin from a poisoning case 2 years earlier in Atlanta, a case where the suspect had ties to underground liquor cellars. Detectives traced the bottle back through layers of back channels until Daniel's name surfaced. He had purchased it weeks before the wedding, his digital trail sloppy, his arrogance, his undoing. When Marcus Doyle came to tell me the results, he did not soften the blow. Daniel had planned this. The glass that nearly killed Harold had been meant for me. The toast was supposed to mark my ending, not my beginning. My stomach churned, the room spun, and though I had suspected, hearing it aloud hollowed me out. My brother had not come to celebrate me. He had come to erase me, to carve out a path for himself where I stood in his way. Rachel held me that night when I told her. Her hands pressed against my back, steady, unshaken, even as mine trembled. She whispered that surviving meant something, that I was here because fate or God or sheer chance had turned the glass toward Harold instead. It was a thought that clawed at me. Guilt mixing with relief, but her words were the only thing that allowed me to breathe. The trial moved quickly. Daniel's pleas of accident, of mistake, fell apart under the weight of evidence. His debts, his attempts to secure loans in my name, his anger at my father's favor toward me all spilled into the courtroom. I sat behind the prosecutors, my hands locked together as Harold testified. His voice did not waver. Rachel spoke too, recounting the look in Daniel's eyes when he handed me the bottle. My father remained silent in court, but when Daniel's eyes searched the room for him, there was no sign of recognition, only steel. The verdict came in guilty: attempted murder, conspiracy, possession of illicit substances. Daniel's sentence was long enough that freedom would be nothing more than a faint shadow in his lifetime. He collapsed when he heard it, screaming at the judge, at me, at fate itself. I did not answer. I only sat in silence, the same silence that had been with me since that night, heavy and unrelenting. After the trial, life did not return to what it was, but it did not end either. Rachel and I moved forward quietly. We held a small dinner with both families, or what was left of them, where Harold raised his glass again, this time filled with simple water, and told us that survival was victory enough. My mother still wept for Daniel, my father remained hardened, and Emily offered Rachel strength I could not always provide. There were nights when I woke drenched in sweat, hearing Daniel's words echo in my ears. This should have been you. There were mornings when I walked into courtrooms and felt the weight of whispers behind me. People judging not the case I carried, but the bloodline that tied me to betrayal. Yet through it all, Rachel's hand remained in mine. That was the only truth I needed to hold. I tell this story not for sympathy, but because survival carries with it the duty to speak. My wedding was shattered, my family torn apart. But I lived. I walked away from the glass that should have ended me. I saw karma catch my brother in the very snare he set for me. Now when I look back, I no longer see just the wreckage. I see Rachel's strength, Harold's courage, and my own ability to keep moving even as the ground cracked beneath me. The day was ruined, yes, but it did not ruin us. We stand still, battered but unbroken, and that is its own form of victory. This is my story, the story of how my wedding turned into a battleground and how blood betrayed me. But I survived, and I chose to keep living. And now I ask you, listening to my words, what would you do if the person you trusted most, the one tied to you by blood, turned out to be the one who wanted you gone?